Hey everybody, it's Willingdon here, and I'm back for part 2 of my All That Remains review. This time I'm going to be talking about the runner cards. I'm going to jump right into it with the first card. This is an Anarch console, a new one. It's called Echo Mind. It's 2 to play, and it's 3 influence. Unique and limit 1 per player, just as all the consoles are. And your memory limit is equal to the number of cards in your grip. This is one of those cards that when you first read it, it seems absolutely incredible, and then when you kind of think it through, you realize it's not that great. So you start with a memory limit of 4, so if you have a full hand of 5 cards, that's only going to give you plus 1 MU. Not really that good. So it seems that the key to making this card work is to somehow increase your hand limit. Now, that's very doable, and there are several cards that do that. Public Sympathy is immediately coming to mind. There's also Theophilus Bagbiter, a criminal resource that essentially when he comes into play, you lose your money, and then your hand limit becomes the amount of money you have. That seems to have some good synergy with this. Also, the origami that was just recently printed could potentially give you plus 9 hand size if you had all 3 in play. So there are some ways to get your hand size up there and thereby give you a ton of MU. And the way I'm thinking about this card, that's pretty much the only type of strategy that would even consider it, this card. Because this card just doesn't do enough for you in a deck that doesn't have a way to massively increase your hand size. But I like the idea that this fills the role of incentivizing and doing this unique thing with hand size. There aren't any other cards in the game that really reward you for the huge hand size, at least on the runner side. So I think having cards like this with really narrow effects that synergize with cards that we've been seeing throughout the course of the game's history, I think it's a good idea to design this type of card. That said, I'm not really eager to try this thing out. I do think potentially we could see a more control-y, less run-oriented Anarch that potentially increases their hand size immensely and then thereby has a ton of MU to kind of do whatever it needs. But right now, I'm not really seeing it. I think this is going to be a good card, though, to come back to once we get Order and Chaos, since we're going to be getting a giant chunk of Anarch cards, and presumably they're going to be focusing on increasing the breadth of the Anarch cards, so this could potentially synergize with some of these upcoming cards that we're about to get for Anarch. Next up, we have the first of the colloquial dogs. This is an Anarch program. It is 3 to install, 1 MU. It's called Cujo, or Cerberus Cujo H3. It's 0 strength, it's 3 influence, it's a killer icebreaker, and when it comes into play, you put 4 power counters on it, and then you can remove a power counter to break 2 century subroutines. It has 1-for-1 on the strength, so you can pay a credit to boost the strength. This is a pretty good icebreaker, and I'm generally in favor of exploring icebreakers that use kind of alternate mechanisms to break rather than just credits. So this power counter idea to me seems like a good one. But in particular, I think this is a really strong icebreaker just because it slots into Anarch in a gap. We have Mimic, which is obviously really strong, but the fixed strength aspect really forces you to play a particular icebreaker setup, whereas this, I think, is a really strong way to deal with a lot of the popular centuries and remain within the Anarch faction. The breaking 2 subroutines, all of the dogs do this, where you can remove a power counter to break 2 subroutines, and I'm inclined to think that breaking 2 century subroutines is the best, just because most of the really popular centuries that are hard to deal with are hard to deal with because they have a lot of subroutines. So being able to use 1 power counter to break multiple subroutines matters quite a bit here. I think the key to this dog and all of the dogs is going to be recurring them in an effective way and capitalizing on them as a thing that you can bring back into play over time. I don't really see you wanting to play this in a deck that doesn't have access to like Clone Chip or Deja Vu or something. So I think the key with these dogs is going to be to build a deck where you can spend the power counters liberally and you can get in and use them often. I think this, along with David, has given Anarch a lot of new, cheaper options that are pretty legitimate in terms of a breaker setup. And I'm liking that we're starting to see people build Anarch decks that aren't using the fixed breaker setup. So I think this is a pretty good icebreaker. The 0 strength is, if it was higher, it would be better. But 0 is pretty acceptable in Centuryland. And the fact that you can boost the strength to the number you actually need, it isn't Mimic where it's fixed. The fact that you can break any Century is going to be nice with this thing. I like this card, and I generally like these dogs. I think that they're mainly going to slot into decks that aren't seeing play right now. So I like new breakers for Anarch, and we'll talk about the rest of the dogs as they come up. Next, we have a new criminal ID. This is Leela Patel. She's 0 link, and she's 4515 like normal. She's a natural. And whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, add 1 unres card to HQ. So I think like with Nasir, Leela is a bit difficult to wrap your head around. Trying to imagine how this is going to be good without playing her extensively is difficult to do. But I do have some Theorycraft stuff with her, and I think she's going to be a pretty good runner. We've seen a lot of criminal IDs that are fairly what I would call opportunistic, in that they sort of just develop their credits and sit around until they see or perceive some kind of weakness in the corporation's defense. And then they play cards like Legwork or Maker's Eye or just things like that to really pounce on vulnerabilities that they see. I think Leela Patel has the potential to just excel at that in a way that we haven't seen out of any other runner. Let's just talk about her ability a little bit and see some of the strongest plays that we can make with it. So one thing I like to do kind of as a thought experiment with most cards is to just think about what the absolute best case scenario would be with the card. So I think with Leela, the best case scenario is returning some card with advancement counters on it to their hand, right? Because then you could delete the work that they had made on the server through the advancement. So I think that's particularly strong against like a Mushin Notion PE deck, because it's pretty conceivable that you could steal an agenda and also return like an advanced card with Mushin in the same turn. That actually seems reasonably likely to me. So her ability would definitely be effective in that matchup. I think the key with her is going to be figuring out a pattern of play that involves running only at the right times, because I think that a lot of her ability is going to rely on when you ran and when the corp had opportunities to res their ice. I'm not really wild about playing her right at the moment, especially with Blue Sun coming up. I've heard several people say that they think this is a good effect against Blue Sun, and I'm inclined to not agree with that. Mainly because Blue Sun has ways to res the ice on their turn, namely Oversight AI. I think the kind of two-prongedness of her ability, and what I mean by that is that you could steal an agenda from one server and then use her ability to soften another server. That aspect seems really strong to me. I just don't know how often that's really going to be something you're able to do. And I think, like I said, it's really about developing a play style and a sort of methodology of play for her where you're able to get in at the correct opportunities and do the damage. But if you don't have those opportunities, you're going to have to be okay with not running. I don't know if there is a great way to build Criminal like that right now, but I think that's the way you're going to have to play her for her to be good. Next, we have the second of the dogs. This is Rex. He's 3 to install, 1 MU, 3 influence as well, and he's a decoder. Place 4 counters on him when he's installed, remove a counter to break 2 code gate subroutines, and then he has 1 for 1 on the strength as well. Like with the Anarch one, I think this one fits a nice gap in the Criminal Breaker setup. Criminals have some decent code gate breakers, but they're fairly restrictive. I think Passport is pretty clearly one of the best, but the problem with it is that it only works on centrals. So a lot of what we're doing in Criminal is spending 2 to 3 influence to just get Azul or Gordian Blade or something like that. And I think that this is a pretty legit option as a way to save influence and still be able to get through the relevant code gates. Now, the obvious weakness I'm seeing with this card is that it really sucks against like Toll Booth or the really expensive code gates, but you do have Femme Fatale in faction, and, well, since you're playing a runner deck, you're probably playing Femme Fatale. So I think that this is a pretty good option to supplement the existing Criminal Breaker suite. I think there's going to be some people who are exploring what we can do with that extra 3 influence if we don't have to play Gordian Blade. That said, I think there are a fair number of Criminal decks that just play Yogg and then maybe like Passport or some sort of supplemental code gate breaker. So if you're just playing the data sucker fixed suite breaker suite thing, I don't really see this being worth it. But like I said with the other dog, if you already have clone chip or some kind of recursion thing, this becomes a lot more of a serious option. So I think we'll see people toying around with this. I'm not sure how good this one's going to be. Next is a new resource for Criminal. It is Zona Azul shipping, and it is 2 to play, 1 influence. Place 1 on Zona Azul shipping when your turn begins, then click take all the credits from it and trash it if you are tagged. I want to briefly point out that this card has the same templating change that I mentioned in the last video when I was talking about Shell Corporation, where it just says place 1 credit. It doesn't specify that that comes from the bank. I think it's really obvious with this card that it's supposed to be from the bank, because otherwise the card is just atrocious. So this card is potentially a long-term powerhouse, but it's not immediately clear which deck on the runner side is going for the long term. I think the thing that is really holding this card back is the amount of effort it takes to just recoup your investment with this card. It's going to be, 3 turns after you install this card where you can even recoup your invested cost, since you have to pay the 2 credits to install the card as well as the click to remove all of the credits from the card. So this isn't a particularly good burst kind of short-term econ card, but I do think that it's pretty strong as a supplemental econ card in a really long-term focus deck. Like I said, I just don't know where we have this long-term focus deck that I'm talking about. Now, this thing becomes pretty scary if you can get multiple of them in play reliably, especially early in the game. I think in general, if you're playing this card, it's probably going to be quite a few of them. I don't really see you wanting to put like one of these in unless you just have an influence you don't know what to do with. But generally my comments about this card are you're going to have to be willing to let it sit in play for quite a few turns for it to even be a card that you would consider in your deck. I don't think this card is bad. I just think that it's difficult to use correctly. And I've talked in the past about how I think difficult to use economy cards are good for the game. So I like this card. I just don't immediately see what to do with it. I feel like that's kind of the hallmark of a decent design. Next up, we have the Cybesoft Macro Drive. This is a Shaper piece of hardware. It's 2 to play, 1 influence, and you get a recurring credit that you can use to install programs. So the immediate comparison here is to like Cyber Feeder or Sahasrara or other cards that give you these recurring credits. I think this one has some pretty distinct advantages over both of those cards I just mentioned. In terms of Cyber Feeder, this is a little better because it's not restricted to viruses, and that seems to jive a lot better with the non-Anarch factions. Versus Sahasrara, this is really good because it doesn't take the MU, so it's going to be a lot easier to build a rig that incorporates this card. It's also worth mentioning that you could use Replicator to get this card since it's a piece of hardware. The first thing I thought with this card was Nasir, mainly because he likes recurring credits and he already plays equipment that would let you utilize this mid-run, like the clone chip or SMC. So I think this card is going to be difficult to use. There aren't a lot of programs that you want to just install over and over and over and over other than icebreakers. And I think that really this card is going to rely on there being a lot of programs that aren't icebreakers that you're going to be able to install every turn, since extracting maximum value from this card is going to rely on you being able to spend the credits nearly every turn. I don't think there's a lot of decks right now that actually have the ability to spend these credits every turn. So I think we're going to be looking at some alternative runners like Nasir or, dare I say, Exile, who might be able to make use of this economy in a way that the existing Shapers cannot. Next we have the last of the dogs. This is the Shaper one. It is Lady. 4 to install, 1 MU, 3 strength as well as 3 influence. Gets the 4 power counters when you install it. Breaks 2 barrier subroutines for a power counter, and then also has the 1-for-1 on strength. The first thing that I will say about this card is that it just completely wrecks Eli 1.0. Eli 1.0 is probably the most popular barrier overall. It's certainly among the top 3 barriers if it isn't the most popular. And this is one of the few ways that you can just get through it for a really inexpensive cost. In fact, I believe Morningstar is the only other breaker that can break Eli 1.0 for 1 credit. So that alone is going to make you want to think about this as an alternative to some of the other in-faction breakers. I think we've been seeing a fair amount of Snowball and Battering Ram and stuff like that emerge. Shapers seem increasingly willing to use in-faction breakers to save some influence and not play Corroder. This is going to get through all the cheap stop ice for nothing, and it's going to deal with one of the scariest barriers for just 1 credit. So I am fairly confident we're going to see some play out of this card. The 3 influence, like with the rest of the dogs, is going to make it really difficult to justify playing it outside of Shaper. And I think that's especially true since Clone Chip is in the Shaper faction, and that seems to be a card that will be essential if you're playing a lot of dogs. So I think Lady is really the one that pushes the dogs into being a competitive type of thing. I don't really know if the deck that utilizes these dogs is going to actually play all 3 of them or maybe even multiple of them, but I think what we're going to see is something that uses Parasite and this card as well as maybe some other breakers that you're planning on recurring like Deus Ex. and you're going to have a very fluid breaker system where programs are coming in and out of play a lot. I also wanted to quickly say at the end of the discussion of the dogs that if there's a card in the future that adds power counters to cards, and I really don't think that that is inconceivable, right? If there's a card that does that, that could be an alternative to the recursion. If there's just a way to recharge the dog, like feed the dog, then I think that could be a viable alternative to rocking the clone chips and things like that. The last card in the pack is Utopia Shard. This is the next in the Shard line that we've seen here. This is a unique resource. It's 7 to play, and it's 1 influence. It's a virtual source type like the other shards. Whenever you make a successful run on HQ, instead of accessing, you can install this, ignoring all costs, and then it has trash. Corp discards 2 cards from HQ at random, limit 1 per deck. The 2 words that really make this card are at random, just because the Corp choosing to discard them would probably make this card unplayably bad. The reason I say that is I see this card being a primary way to disrupt the sort of kill hands that some decks build, like the triple scorched in hand type deck, or the sit back on a bunch of neural EMPs type deck. This is going to be a way to disrupt that, and that's something that the runner doesn't really have. Another pretty obvious play with this card is that if you know or think it's likely that they have a lot of agendas, making them discard 2 cards at random is going to be a way to get those out of their hand, potentially access them in archives, and not have to get through whatever kind of defense they have on HQ. That said, I think we're going to be seeing this card mainly in decks that already get into HQ a lot, just because you're not going to want to pay 7 for this unless there's just an ultimate situation where it's going to wreck them. So I think this is going to be viable mainly in criminals, but also maybe some other decks that are just able to get into HQ early in the game. I think it's especially strong in decks that already get some kind of bonus for HQ. Like, I think Gabe pretty clearly wants to play this, in my opinion. So I think this is going to be fairly limited, but it does have a really powerful effect, and the random discard is something that we just don't have, and I would honestly like to see more of, because that critical sniping their scorched out of hand play could potentially be game winning, and I think it'd be cool if there were alternatives to defeating Scorched Earth that weren't just about preventing the meat damage, but were instead about attacking the Scorched Earth in their hand. Based on some spoilers that already exist, I think there are going to be more cards that have that type of idea in mind. So the random discard, that's the biggest thing I'm seeing with this. Well, unfortunately, that is the end of the All That Remains pack. I think at the beginning of the other video, I said that this was one of my favorite packs of all time, and I kind of want to justify that a little bit. I think this pack has some of the strongest cohesiveness and thematic awareness of any pack. We see almost complete cycles of cards within the pack. We also see a lot of related card types, in that the Corp got a lot of 3-for-1 agendas, and we got all these dogs on this side, and the cycle of ice. There's just a very coherent feel to this pack, and the thing that I really like about that sort of decision making when it comes to building the cards that are in a particular pack is that it makes it a lot easier for a player who doesn't buy all the packs to know which packs they want to buy. If we instead spaced all the dogs out among a bunch of packs, 3 different packs, that makes it a little harder for a player who wants to build a thematic deck based around the dogs. So I like the idea that you can just buy this one pack because you know that you want to do something that's contained within the pack, and you can do that just with the one pack. I think as Netrunner comes out with more and more packs, we're going to want to appeal to players who aren't necessarily buying every data pack, but are instead buying the data packs that they see being valuable to their collection. And making the packs have a theme is going to give those types of players a better feeling about whether they should or should not buy the pack. Now, of course, a goal of my videos is to help you decide that as well, so hopefully I've provided some utility in that respect. There's some good singletons in here, but I really like the kind of cycles or groups of related cards, and I really strongly hope they do that in the future. Well, that's going to do it for the video today. If you liked it, please press subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you again pretty soon for some more Netrunner content. This is Willing Done signing off.